homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today, on what is probably the coldest or the second coldest day of this wintry year, we are making silver maple syrup. Did you know you can make sugar syrups out of different trees besides just sugar maples? I'll put a list up on the screen of different other trees that you can make syrup out of. I've done a couple of different ones over the years. I don't happen to live in the eastern part of the United States where sugar maples are native. And we have a couple of sugar maples planted here on this property that we planted when we moved here, but they take quite a while to mature. And in order to tap a tree, you need it to be at least 10 inches in diameter, and they're not nearly big enough for that. It turns out that silver maples can also be tapped. The difference is the amount of sugar that's in the syrup. And so a sugar maple has a higher percentage of sugar, which means it takes less energy to boil it down to actually get syrup. But if you're willing to put in the work and you've got a lot of extra wood, or you don't mind the extra cost of gas on your stove, you can boil down quite a few different types of trees to get a syrup. And I always like the idea of having access to different sweeteners on my homestead. Honey is the obvious one that most people talk about as a homesteading kind of syrup. But it turns out I'm not a great beekeeper. I always feel like Godzilla ripping off the roof of a house and going, "Heh." And so I hesitate to get in there when I should, and I don't know exactly what I'm looking for because I don't have a lot of experience. And I've kept bees a couple of different times and had them get through the winter and then completely swarm in the spring to the point where they left the original hive completely behind. I've given up on beekeeping. I do have some beehives on my property that a friend keeps, and it's great because I get the pollination and I don't have to do any of the other work. And he gives me a little bit of honey for that and a little bit of beeswax, which is also great. But it's nice to have an alternative sugar source. And if you're interested in sorghum as a sugar source, I've done several videos on using sorghum to make sorghum syrups, and so you can check that out too. But this is a great addition as well. And so I'm going to show you how to make silver maple syrup. Let's get started.
So these are our silver maple trees. We have two of them, and they were on the property when we bought the property. So they probably date from 1997, 1998. So they've got some pretty good age on them. We have tapped them in the past, as you can see the old scars, but it's been probably 10 years. So it's been a long time since we've tapped these. It's very hard to get the timing right on these in our climate. It really generally needs to be done in January. Silver maples leaf out very early in the spring. They're one of the first things to bloom and start growing. And so if you wait too long, you don't get good syrup. Too long is really in February. And so we really need to tap these in January if we're going to get the timing right. And I often just am too busy with other things in January and completely forget about it. I bought this tapping system about 14 years ago when I was living up in Spokane. We had several very large box elder trees on that property, and I found out that you could tap box elder trees, and so that was what I originally started with. I have a very old blog post on that process, and then we really haven't used these a lot since then. There's lots of different ways of tapping trees. This is what we went with instead of a metal spile. Spile is another name for these taps. There's a specific diameter that you need to drill here, and that you're drilling about an inch into the tree. And so we've marked on the drill with some tape so that we don't overly drill. And then we're just tapping that tap in, and then I'm using 1 gallon glass bottles for capturing the sap. If you've got a lot of flow, you can use bigger containers. I've used plastic carboys in the past, but this is adequate for our use here. And interestingly, every year is a little bit different on this, and I was determined this year I was going to get it right, and so we tapped these about the middle of January, and we are now the middle of February. It's the 14th of February, and we haven't gotten a lot of sap out of these. The last of January was beautiful weather. It was perfect, I thought, for tapping trees, which is it needs to be below freezing at night and then up into the 40s during the day. And we got a little bit, and I did a couple of small batches on my stove, but we really didn't get a lot And I find that if the sun isn't out, these trees just don't move sap. I think having the sun beating on the bark makes a big difference. This is a walnut tree, and so we went ahead and tapped a black walnut tree as well. I've never done English walnuts, but my understanding is you can tap any of the nuts that are in that family. This is an old hotel pan that I used the first time I did sap when I was living up in Spokane with those box elder trees. And then this is just a homemade boiling setup. And so we scrounged all of the cinder blocks that had been laying all over the property from the last time I did this 10 years ago and dug them back out and set up back up again. And then we have this old stovepipe from an old stove that was in our house when we moved in that we removed. And so that makes a good chimney, but you can also stack just cinder blocks and make a chimney out of that if you do that right. So there's lots of ways of configuring this. And then we got a fire going in there, mostly just to burn the moisture off of the bricks because these bricks were really wet. They'd been out all winter and had lots of wet detritus and soil in them. And so I just wanted to kind of do a test run just to make sure that it wasn't super smoky. You're trying to get the smoke away from your boiling pan because otherwise you're going to end up with smoky syrup. And so it's important to have some kind of ventilation on the system to get the smoke up and away so that you're not getting ash and smoke into your boiler. And just cleaning up detritus from the yard and getting this going. And then I put some water in here just to make sure that I didn't boil the pan and end up warping the pan, but this was a test run. So got some water in there. You can see it's starting to steam, so it is working. And this works great if you've got 5 gallons of sap that you're trying to boil down. This is a couple of days later. There's a little bit of sap coming on these trees. So this is probably 17th, 18th of January. Not much. And then again, poured that off. You should pour it off fairly frequently because if it sits too long, it will start to ferment, especially if the sap is in sunlight. This was a jug that was collected about 3 or 4 days ago, so second week in February. We really hadn't gotten a lot previous to this, but this one tree, and it's interesting, I had 4 taps on these trees, 2 on each tree because they're big older trees. This one tap did really well, and then all the rest of them were pretty small. The sap in there was frozen, and so I had to bring it in, let it thaw out, and then running it through a strainer because there's going to be a little bit of stuff that's fallen into that bottle. And then here's the rest of what I collected. 2 other bottles that weren't too bad, but they weren't nearly as full as the first one. And then one that had very little in it that I just emptied into one of the other bottles. And you can see this has still got some ice in it, so I had to thaw it in the house for a couple of hours before I could get it out of the bottle. And then these went back out and we'll put them back out on the trees. When the tree actually actively starts leafing out, the sap gets really grassy and is not worth eating. You're going to get some foam when you first start boiling this down. And I decided to do this in the house just because I didn't have enough volume to do it outside. Skim that foam off, and then you're gonna just cook this down and cook it down and cook it down. I'm not sure what the ratio is with silver maple syrup, but it's definitely more than 40-to-1 in terms of parts water to part sugar. So it's gonna take quite a while to do this. I set a timer on my stove, and at once an hour, when it's still got a lot of volume, I just check it. That stuff in the bottom that you see here as we're consolidating and concentrating down is called sugar sand. And it is really common with silver maples. It's common with all maples, but it's really common with sugar maples. And part of the reason they don't tap silver maples in commercial operations is because there's so much sugar sand. It's just minerals from the tree. It doesn't hurt anything, but if you're on a big commercial system, it clogs everything up. So as this gets all the way cooked down, when you swirl the pan, you start getting really fine bubbles. If you've watched some of my other syrup videos, you recognize this. And this is about where you want to stop. You can do this with a thermometer. I've done it enough that I've just kind of gotten a good visual on it. Here I'm tasting it, making sure that it seems to be at the right stickiness. If you cook it down too far, it will crystallize in the jar. And so you want it to be a little bit loose, just like maple syrup is a little bit loose. And then here we are pouring this into the jar. I meant to put this through a finer strainer to filter out some of that sugar sand, and I just completely forgot when I was filming this. But here is our finished silver maple syrup. And from what was probably about 1.5 gallons of sap on this run, I ended up with probably about 5 ounces of finished syrup, although I didn't measure the beginning, so I'm not sure exactly what I had here. A little bit more of that protein foam on the top. I actually ate this. I just skimmed it off and put it in my mouth. So there's nothing wrong with this other than it doesn't look pretty. But this is a really fun project, and it was a nice way to put some humidity in the house this time of year when it's really cold and dry, and we've got the wood stove running all the time. But silver maple syrup or any other kind of tree that you can tap, give this recipe a try in the wintertime, tribe. It's really a fun project. I ended up using some of the first batch of syrup that I had made earlier in the month to add to some home ground peanut butter that I made for the first time, and it was just fantastic. Have you ever tapped a tree for syrup? Tell me about it in the comments. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.